I have a fairly long question that talks about why God allows suffering. And obviously that's an important question because people have been asking it for a very long time in various different variations of it. Some say, why does God allow suffering? Why does God allow evil to exist? Why does God allow why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? So I'm not going to read the whole question through at once because it's so long. So I'm going to read it in sections and then comment on it. So in the beginning here, if we describe duality as a man who's already drunk and can no longer think straight, and let's assume this man is very, very slowly walking towards a road full of speeding and dangerous cars, why did God allow this drunkard to walk to his own death, just so that its own law of free will is not disturbed? And so, in order to really, this question was posted as a comment to some of my non-duality videos about free will. So it's probably good to look at these videos if you're interested, because it gives a deep understanding of free will. But the first thing I would say to this question is, but aren't you sort of looking at an immediate situation where the man is already drunk without asking, well, how did he become drunk? How did he become so drunk that he can't even see where he's going? And if you realize that, you realize that he made the choice to drink, and he made that choice because he has free will. And him being drunk and walking towards the road is really not God's doing. It's the result of the man's choices. How free they were, we can debate, but he made the choice, right? So this leads to the next question is, what's your image of God? What's your view of God? Now, if you look at this historically, and I've talked about this in some other videos, where I actually say that human beings have collectively created this non-existent God, but it has a certain temporary existence in the collective consciousness. And it's the Old Testament God who can be seen as the angry being in the sky. But it can also be seen as an external God that is like a micromanager. That's always there, looking at people, and if you pray to him or please him or worship him, then he might step in and prevent you from walking out in front of a speeding car. So why is this image so appealing to people? And it's appealing because they're projecting out. They can project out that whatever their problems is, it's caused by God. Or they can project out that, well, maybe we did something ourselves, but God should have stepped in and saved us. And what I'm explaining in my videos where I talk about free will, and even the video where I talk about how the world was created, is that the Creator has given us free will. And there's a reason for that, which I won't go into here. But the Creator has given us free will. Free will. And you cannot logically say you want free will, but if I make a choice that leads to unpleasant consequences, God should step in and prevent those consequences. See, you're not saying God should step in and prevent me from making choices. Like you're not saying God should have stepped in and prevented the guy from getting drunk. But you're saying that now that he has chosen to become drunk, God should step in and prevent him from dying. So the question is, do you want to have free will or do you not want to have free will? Because if you're saying to God, God, I want to have freedom to make choices, but I want you to monitor me the whole time so that if I make a choice that leads to bad consequences, you step in and save me, right? Is that a deal, God? And that's just not how free will works. I mean, you can't really talk about free will and then say that God should be ready to step in and protect you from the consequences of your choices. And I have also explained in these videos that the purpose of giving us free will is actually because it's an opportunity, and it's actually the only way we can expand our sense of self. So we could say that the way we grow is that we make a choice, we experience a consequence, and then we decide, do I want more of the same consequence, or do I want more than this? And if we want more than this, we transcend our sense of self. So that's how free will works. I mean, you really cannot have free will and at the same time have this micromanaging God looking over your shoulder and say, oh no, you shouldn't make that free choice. So then it goes on. Is God's self-transcendence more important than all the suffering in this entire universe, even if only a minority of planets are fallen? Why the very existence of suffering and imperfections in this universe? To force the creation to always transcend? I only want to know God's point of view, and if not, then the Ascended Master's view on this. And so again, you need to kind of know what I'm talking about in these videos. And again, you can look at the how the world was created. And the idea is that the entire creation is actually growing. The whole purpose of the world of form is that we who are the self-aware beings in it, we are growing. We are expanding our sense of self. And we do this by exercising our free will and experiencing the consequences of it. So again, you could say that this question is kind of asked from inside the world on an unnatural planet like Earth where there's suffering. So you can say, of course, many people have done this. They're in a state of mind where they feel they're suffering. They don't like it. They don't feel it's right. But they're still projecting out that their suffering is caused by God or by external circumstances. And this is why the external God appeals to people, because they can push responsibility away from themselves and say, well, it's God that's making me suffer. And it's God's fault that there's suffering in the world. But as I explained in these videos, the vast majority of planets are actually what I call natural planets where there isn't suffering. And Earth is one of the few where there is suffering. So why are we on Earth? Because we have made choices in past lives. And these are the choices made collectively by the inhabitants of the Earth that have lowered the Earth to this level where there's suffering. And so, again, you know, this is a consequence of free will, right? Where there isn't the micromanaging God that's preventing us from experiencing the consequences of our choices. Because how would we learn and grow if we were protected from the consequences of our choices? So it's again this, the inhabitants of the Earth were given free will. They chose to use that free will over a long period of time to bring the Earth to this level where there's suffering. Should God then step in and wipe out suffering? How could God do that without also taking away free will? And God isn't going to violate its own law. So it's like it's again this, you know, you're not taking responsibility for yourself. And then you can say, well, then it's the law of free will and God's law of free will that has led to suffering. No, it isn't. It's not the law of free will that led to suffering. It's the choices people made. But they didn't have to make those choices. They weren't forced to make those choices. God gives us free will, and it's possible that we can choose, as I've explained, to go into separation and duality, which causes us to suffer, or rather it causes us to experience suffering. But there's nothing forcing us to do this, it's choices we make. And God has designed the universe in such a way that no matter how far we've gone into separation, we can always come back to a state of mind where we are connected beings, where we don't suffer. Because as I've explained, the core of our being is this conscious you, and the conscious you can go into any sense of self that it creates. No, that's why I say it's pure awareness. can go any sense of identity that it can imagine or that it has been created here on earth. You can go into it and say, what does it feel like to experience that sense of self from the inside? And then you go inside of it and then you say, oh, but I don't like this. This is suffering. And then the law of free will and the entire universe is set up so that if you don't like it, you can choose to go out of it again because you haven't become that separate self that you went into. So there's always a way out of suffering. There's always a way to avoid suffering. And if you're still suffering, it's actually because you haven't made use of that way. And God has created the universe in such a way that we always have access to the one mind that I've talked about. We also have access to spiritual teachers who have united with the one mind, the ascended masters. And if we are willing to take advantage of this, then they can help us escape suffering. But they're not going to do it by removing the suffering. They're going to help us by making us aware that the suffering is an experience caused by a separate self. And the only way out of the suffering is to let the separate self die, for the conscious you to separate itself from that self and then just let it die. And that's what the masters will help us do. But if we don't take advantage of that, what can the masters do? Now you could say here that but we don't allow our children to go out and play in the street where they could be run down by a car. And I would say, yeah, that's true as long as the children are young. But have you ever had a teenager in the house? There just comes a point where you have to say, well, there's nothing I can say here. I just have to hope he survives. Because they're not willing to listen. And that's the case with most people on Earth. As I said, originally the Earth was a natural planet where the people had direct access to the ascended masters. But then when the planet collectively went into duality, humanity went into duality, they lost that contact. But that was, again, choices they made. And how can the ascended masters step in without violating people's free will? I mean, people have essentially, by making this choice to go into duality and separation, they've essentially said, I don't want to have anything to do with the ascended masters. Leave me alone. I want to have my own experiences. So, back to the question. To the fallen beings and narcissists, anyone who doesn't conform to their own dualistic beliefs are then punished or destroyed. To God, anyone who doesn't self-discover then suffers or eventually gets destroyed in the second death. Just like how natives are invaded by outsiders and the ascended masters allowed it because of their refusal to change. Like how fallen beings are allowed to enter this world even if massive horror and suffering will occur to the inhabitants next. Shock therapy, the end justifies the means. So this refers to, and you can again hear about it in this video on how the world was created, that there was a point where the earth was it had entered a downward spiral that, if it was allowed to continue, would lead to the planet being destroyed. And so the Ascended Masters decided that as an experiment that could hopefully avoid this destruction of the planet, they would allow the fallen beings to embody here. And I've explained more about what fallen beings are and why they are always seeking to control and why they will basically what they did was they stirred up the collective consciousness. They disturbed people because people were so homogeneous at the time that there was really no room for creativity. So the fallen beings stirred up that sense that all is well and we just need to all be the same because they don't want to conform to any rules. So obviously the fallen beings also brought warfare and torture and many kinds of suffering to the planet. And I can understand why you can look at this and say, well, that means that people are now suffering even more and the Ascended Masters are allowing this. But again, people were actually suffering before the fallen beings came to Earth. Not necessarily the same way, but they were still suffering because there wasn't any creativity. And if nothing had been done, then the planet would have self-destructed. And for the original inhabitants of a planet to experience that their planet disintegrates this is an extreme form of suffering. I mean, it's an enormous trauma, because these beings were created here on earth to grow here on earth. It's their home, it's their frame of reference, and if it suddenly disintegrates, they don't know what to do with themselves. It's a very, very extreme form of trauma. So you could say that the Ascended Masters had to make a calculated decision here. Would they allow the planet to self-destruct and people experiencing that trauma? Or would they allow the fallen beings here so that they would experience the trauma inflicted by the fallen beings, but it could still lead to growth? And if you look at planet Earth, then there is, I know many people probably can't see this, but as I explained in some of my videos, there is actually an upward trend. There was an upward spiral that has been started on Earth. And part of the reason why this upward trend was started was that there was a group of avatars that embodied on Earth along with the fallen beings. I explained that in my avatar videos. So we are here to kind of hold the balance for the fallen beings so they can't destroy the planet. Now, again, you could say, well, why did the Ascended Masters allow this? Is this the ends can justify the means? And my reaction would be that I really don't see it that way. I mean, the fallen beings, they have this mindset that, like Hitler, you know, our goal is to purify the Aryan race, and therefore it's justified that we kill the Jews. And they would have killed all Jews on the planet if they could. And this is obviously the ends can justify the means, because what it says is it's okay to kill other people in order to attain some kind of goal. And so what you can say here is this: the law of free will is the absolute law for this universe. So you can say that what you call it, the worst way to harm other people or to violate the laws of God is to violate other people's free will. And obviously killing people is the most dramatic way to violate their free will. It's certainly not the only one, but it's a very extreme form. Forcing them, suppressing them, fooling them, manipulating them are also ways to violate people's free will. And so the fallen beings are always seeking to violate people's free will, because they have no respect for the free will of human beings. And they have this, you know, the ends can justify the means attitude, the ends of them being in control and them being proven right. That can, it doesn't matter how much suffering it creates. But the Ascended Masters are not thinking that way. They are not violating people's free will by allowing the fallen beings to embody here. They're not violating the law of free will. They are simply they are, in a sense, trying to protect people from the extreme outcome of their choices. The extreme outcome being the destruction of the planet. So I wouldn't even think of saying that this is the ends can justify the means. And again, you know, there is no necessity that people had to suffer as they are suffering because of the fallen beings. They could just have refused to follow the fallen beings and listen to the avatars and reconnected to the Ascended Masters. So there's always a way out of suffering. But you can say that the law of free will has kind of two aspects. It is that one is that you are put in an environment where you make choices how you react to that environment. And then you can, as I've said many times, you can choose to expand your connection to something outside your own mind, the Ascended Masters, your higher self. And then you can avoid suffering. You can even be on a planet like Earth and avoid suffering. You look at it today and you see there are many people that are suffering, but there are people that aren't suffering. So the other aspect of the law of free will is what I call the school of hard knocks. That's when you say, I'm not going to take advantage of the Ascended Masters. I'm not going to listen to other people. I'm going to go into separation, and I'm going to use my own mind to create a worldview that I elevate to the status of being absolute. And that's a state of separation, but that's a choice to go in there. But when people go into it, they have, in a sense, they have neutralized the ascended masters, because the ascended masters cannot help people at that stage without violating the law of free will. So that means the ascended masters have to step back and say, well, the consequences of people's choices is going to be their teacher. And in the school of hard knocks, it's only a matter of how hard do the knocks have to become before people say, I can't do this anymore, I've had enough, there must be a better way, is there somebody who can help me? And once they ask for help, then the ascended master can step in. So this then, I think, leads to the rest of the question. Well, actually, there was this again about in God's system, if you don't transcend yourself, you are punished. And I would say that it's not God punishing you, because again, there isn't a micromanaging God who's looking at everything we do. God doesn't, the Creator doesn't really look at anything in an undescended sphere. We are punishing ourselves by the choices we are making. And if we, it's again this, in God's system, the whole idea is you create a mental image in your mind, you project it out. Something comes back to you from the environment. And when you see what's coming back, you are saying, do I want more of this, or do I want more than this? And if you want more of the same, you just keep projecting out the same image. But if you want something more than that, you have to say, okay, then I have to look at what I'm projecting out. And if I change what's projecting out, I will change what comes back. But when people go into duality, they can't see this. They refuse to see this because they refuse to take responsibility. They refuse to acknowledge that what is coming back to them is a result of what they projected out. Instead, they say, oh, it's God's fault. It's the universe's fault. It's the fallen being's fault. It's other people's fault. It's these other people that are the cause of my suffering. They are always, you're always in the separate mind, you're always projecting out. Okay, so the last part of the question, what if someone wants to be away from oneness and objectivity, God's subjectivity, and yet not abandoned? That's the essence of why all fallen beings feel abandoned and rejected by God. What do the ascended masters do? All they do is point out their endless illusions and inferiority, their mistakes and stuff. How is this approach supposed to work on those already drunk with separation? Does love reject and hate separation and duality? So, start with this abandoned. What does it say here? What if someone wants to be away from oneness and yet not abandoned? But it's again this, step back and think about what is being said here. How could you be away from oneness without feeling abandoned? In oneness, you are connected. When you see yourself as a connected being, you're connected to a higher self, to the ascended master, you don't feel abandoned. But that's because you are accepting that you don't know everything, you are not complete in yourself, you are part of something bigger. But then you are saying now, and so you could say that when you are connected, you are seeking to find out how does the world actually work. And you're realizing that you can only receive that from outside your own mind because you can't figure it out in your own mind how the world works. When you go into separation, you're essentially saying, I don't want to have a teacher who tells me how the world works. I either want to figure it out on myself, or you're actually saying, I want to define how the world should work. This is what the fallen beings are doing. They are trying to define how the world should work, and they think that if they come up with the ultimate definition, even God has to admit that they're right. And that is, of course, what causes them to feel abandoned. Because you are saying to the real God, the real Creator, I don't want to know you, I don't want to know how you work. I want to create my own image of God. And then I want the real God to conform to that image. Well, the real Creator has said, you can create any image of me you want, but I'm not going to conform to it. So what I'm saying here is it's just simple logic. If you go into separation and duality, if you go away from oneness, you will feel abandoned. How could you not? The separate self will feel abandoned, and it will project out, oh, God has abandoned me. The Ascended Masters has abandoned me. But is that really the way it is? Isn't it rather that the separate self has abandoned God and has abandoned the Ascended Masters, because the separate self has said, I don't want you to come and tell me how the world works. I want to define this myself. So leave me alone. Stay away from me. And if you say to somebody, stay away from me, and then when you start suffering, you blame them. You have abandoned me. You should not have allowed me to suffer. What are you saying? I mean, you have this old saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? I mean, it just, there's no logic. If you really apply logic here, there's no logic to what the fallen beings are saying, what they are feeling. It's just not the case. They haven't been abandoned. And so then the question is, and this is an interesting question again, you know, how is, so what the questioner is saying is that the fallen beings, they feel abandoned and rejected by God, but all the Ascended Masters doing is trying to point out their endless illusions and inferiority, their mistakes and stuff. How is this approach supposed to work on those already drunk with separation? And it's the same as the question started out talking about this man who was drunk and walking towards the busy road. But what the questioner is always also saying is, the man is already drunk and can no longer think straight. But now in the end, the question is saying, the fallen beings are like the drunk man. They are blinded by duality and they can't think straight. But the Ascended Masters should still step in and make them see what they're doing and make them think straight, even though they're not. So how exactly could that work, right? And I think the kind of misunderstanding here is that it seems like the questioner is saying that when the Ascended Masters are pointing out the fallen consciousness and the illusions in the fallen consciousness, this is to help the fallen beings. But the Ascended Master teachings about fallen beings are not given for the fallen beings, because the Ascended Masters know that they can't reach the fallen beings with anything. The fallen beings are in the school of hard knocks, and it's just a matter of how hard do the knocks have to become before a fallen being reaches that turning point where it says, I can't do this anymore. It doesn't mean that the Ascended Masters have abandoned fallen beings, because if a fallen being reaches that turning point, there will immediately be a Ascended Master who will step in and offer to help that fallen being get back to a sense of connectedness, get out of separation and duality. So the Masters are always ready to help anybody, but they can't, because of the law of free will and even the logic of free will, they can't help people who are not open to it. And so when the Ascended Masters give teachings about fallen beings and the fallen mindset, they are primarily given for avatars, because, as I explained in my avatar videos, for us who are avatars, it is very important to understand that they are fallen beings, what they are, what kind of a mindset, what kind of illusions they use, so we can free ourselves from these illusions, because having embodied on earth many times, we have, you know, without really knowing it, taken on some of these illusions. And it's partly also given for the original inhabitants of the earth who can come to see what the fallen beings are doing, to control them, what kind of destruction they have created on earth, so that they can make the choice. Do they want to continue following the fallen beings, as many people have done over the course of history, or do they want to follow either avatars or the Ascended Masters? So they're really exposing the fallen consciousness to give both avatars and the original inhabitants a choice that you don't have when you don't know about the fallen beings and the illusions of the duality consciousness. So it's, you know, the fallen beings, of course, and it's the same thing, whether you're a fallen being or not, once you go into duality and create a separate self, what essentially happens is that you think, the separate self thinks, I'm the center of the universe. I'm the only one who's important here. Everything revolves around me. And that's also partly what led to the creation of this Old Testament God, because the separate self wants a God who is like the micromanager. And it wants a God that it can manipulate. So it wants that God who supposedly steps in and saves me from my own choices. And so again, it's projecting out, always projecting out, but refusing to take responsibility for yourself. That if you are suffering, the cause of your suffering is not external circumstances, it's internal circumstances. It's your own psychology, it's the separate selves you have in your subconscious mind that are causing you to suffer, because the conscious you is not suffering. It has stepped into a separate self, and now it's experiencing life through the filter of that self, and that's what causes the sense of suffering, the experience of suffering. But there is no objective suffering out there. There's no suffering outside your mind. Suffering is an inner experience, and therefore the way to overcome suffering is not to change outer conditions here in the world, changing other people, or changing God or God's law. It's changing yourself. Just look at yourself. Are you identified with these subconscious selves? And then that identification will cause you to suffer, but the conscious you has the potential to break that identification, and that's essentially what the teachings of the Ascended Master is all about.